I still remember the exact moment my life changed, and the strange thing is, I didn't even realize it was happening. It was a Friday afternoon in late September, the kind of day where the sun still felt like summer, but the wind carried the first whispers of autumn, and I was sitting on the front steps of my house waiting for my mom to finish yelling at me about my grades. I was 17, skinny in that awkward way where my shoulders hadn't caught up to my height yet, with hair that flopped into my eyes because I was too lazy to get it cut, and I had exactly one friend in the entire world. Her name was Cassidy Monroe, and she lived 3 houses down from me, and she was the reason I ended up in the situation I'm about to tell you about, though if you asked her now, she'd probably say it was my own fault, and honestly, she wouldn't be entirely wrong. Cassidy had been my best friend since we were both 8 years old, back when neither of us understood that boys and girls weren't supposed to be inseparable, and by the time we hit high school, we'd stopped caring what anyone thought. She was the kind of girl who wore combat boots with sundresses and dyed streaks of pink into her dark hair and could talk her way out of any detention. I was the kind of boy who followed her around like a lost puppy because she was the only person who made my life feel interesting. So when she showed up at my front door that Friday afternoon with a duffel bag slung over her shoulder and a grin that meant trouble, I already knew I was going to say yes to whatever she was about to ask because I always said yes to Cassidy. She plopped down next to me on the steps and told me her parents were going to Vermont for the weekend to visit her grandmother, and she didn't want to be alone in that big empty house, and she needed me to sleep over. I laughed and told her we hadn't done a sleepover since we were 12, and she gave me that look, the one where her eyebrow arched just slightly and her lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile, and she said that was exactly why we needed to do one now, for old time's sake. I should have known something was off. Cassidy never did anything just for old time's sake. Cassidy was a schemer, a planner, a girl who thought 3 moves ahead of everyone else in any given room, and if she wanted a sleepover, there was a reason. But I was 17 and stupid and hopelessly devoted to my best friend, so I told her I'd be over by 7, and she stood up, dusted off the back of her jeans, and walked away humming a song I didn't recognize. I spent the next 2 hours packing an overnight bag, and I remember being weirdly nervous, which didn't make sense because I'd been in Cassidy's house 1,000 times. I knew every creaky floorboard, every family photo in the hallway, every stain on the living room rug where her little brother had spilled grape juice years ago. But something about this felt different, and I couldn't put my finger on it. I threw in a change of clothes, my toothbrush, my phone charger, and a paperback book I'd been pretending to read for 3 weeks, and then I stood in front of my bedroom mirror and stared at myself for a long moment. I don't know why I did that. I wasn't the kind of kid who looked in mirrors much, mostly because I didn't like what I saw. I had this face that hadn't quite decided what it wanted to be yet, all soft angles and long lashes, and a mouth that was too full for the rest of me. Kids at school used to call me pretty when they wanted to hurt my feelings, and it always worked because deep down I knew they were right, and I hated that I couldn't figure out how to look more like the other boys. But that afternoon, staring into the mirror with my duffel bag at my feet, I felt something I hadn't felt before. It wasn't quite curiosity, and it wasn't quite dread. It was something in between, like when you're standing at the top of a hill on a bicycle and you know you're about to go down, and you can't decide if you're excited or terrified. I shook it off, told myself I was being weird, and headed out the door. Cassidy's house was one of those old Victorian places with the wraparound porch and the turret on the corner, painted a color her mom called sage green, but everyone else called mint. The lights were on when I walked up, and the front door was unlocked, which was how it always was when her parents weren't home, because Cassidy believed that locking doors was a sign of weakness, whatever that meant. I let myself in, called out her name, and heard her voice float down from upstairs telling me to come up. I climbed the stairs, familiar with every step, and found her in her bedroom, which was the same as it had always been, but somehow different. Her walls were painted this deep dusty rose color, and she had string lights draped around the ceiling, and her bed was piled with pillows in every shade of pink and cream. But there was something new. Spread across the bed, laid out like she'd been planning it for hours, was a small mountain of clothes. Skirts and blouses and dresses and things I couldn't even identify, in fabrics that looked soft and shimmery under the string lights. And in the middle of it all, arranged with what looked like actual care, was a full makeup kit, the kind with those tiered drawers that fold out like a treasure chest. I stopped in the doorway. Cassidy was sitting cross-legged on the floor, painting her toenails a color she called oxblood, and she looked up at me with the most innocent expression I'd ever seen on her face, which is how I knew immediately that I was in trouble. I asked her what all of this was, and she said it in the most casual voice, like she was telling me what she'd had for lunch. She said she wanted to do a makeover. I laughed because I thought she was joking, and I told her I appreciated the effort, but I didn't really need makeup. She looked at me and said very slowly, very deliberately, that the makeover wasn't for her. It was for me. I remember the exact way my stomach dropped, that hollow feeling like an elevator falling one floor too fast, and I remember trying to laugh again, but the sound came out weird and thin, and Cassidy just kept looking at me with that same calm expression. She told me she'd been thinking about it for months. She told me she'd been watching me, watching the way I moved, the way my face looked in certain lights, the way my hair curled around my ears when it got humid. She told me she thought I would look beautiful, and she wanted to prove it, not to anyone else, just to me. She said no one would ever have to know. It would be one night in her bedroom, with the door locked and the curtains drawn, and if I hated it, we would wash everything off and never speak of it again. I stood there in the doorway with my duffel bag still slung over my shoulder, and I felt this weird thing happening in my chest, like my heart was beating in two different rhythms at once. Part of me wanted to turn around and walk out of that house and never look back. Part of me wanted to drop my bag and say yes before I could change my mind. And a third part of me, the smallest but somehow the loudest, wanted to know what she saw when she looked at me, what she thought I could become. I told her okay. Just like that. One word, quiet, almost a whisper. Cassidy didn't jump up or squeal or celebrate. She just nodded, like she'd known all along that I would say yes, and she stood up carefully so she wouldn't smudge her toenails, and she padded over to me and took my duffel bag off my shoulder and set it on the chair by her desk. Then she took my hand, and her fingers were cold from the nail polish drying, and she led me over to her vanity. She pushed me down onto the little cushioned stool in front of the mirror, and she stood behind me, and for a long moment we just looked at each other's reflections. I saw my face, pale and uncertain, my brown eyes wider than usual, my mouth slightly parted. And I saw her face behind me, calm and focused, her dark hair with the pink streaks tumbling over one shoulder, her eyes bright with something that looked almost like tenderness. She put her hands on my shoulders, and she said very quietly that she was going to take care of me. And then she got to work. She started with my hair. She had this spray bottle full of water that she misted over my head until my hair was damp, and then she took a brush and worked through every tangle with a patience I didn't know she had. She talked while she worked, keeping her voice low and steady, telling me stupid stories about her math teacher and her cousin's wedding and the boy she'd had a crush on in 7th grade.
I don't remember what she said.
I remember the sound of her voice, the way it wrapped around me like a blanket, the way it made me feel like I was somewhere very far away from myself. When my hair was smooth and shining, she pulled out a curling iron and plugged it into the outlet next to the vanity. I watched in the mirror as she wrapped section after section of my hair around the barrel, holding each one for just a few seconds before releasing it into a soft, loose curl. I hadn't realized my hair was long enough to curl. It fell past my ears, past my jawline in some spots, and when she was done there was this cascade of waves framing my face, and I didn't recognize myself. I mean, I did, obviously, it was still my face, but it wasn't the face I saw every morning in the bathroom mirror. It was softer somehow, prettier, and I didn't know how to feel about that. Cassidy caught me staring and she smiled, but she didn't say anything. She just moved on to the next step. She took a headband, one of those soft fabric ones, and pushed my hair back off my forehead. Then she pulled out a bottle of something and squeezed a small amount onto her fingers. She told me it was primer, whatever that meant, and she dabbed it across my forehead and cheeks and chin. Her fingers were gentle, but they moved with confidence, like she'd done this 100 times before, which I guess she had, just not on me. Next came the foundation. She held up 2 different bottles and squinted at my face, comparing shades, and then she chose one and started applying it with a little damp sponge. The sensation was strange. Cool at first, then warm as it dried, and I could feel my skin changing under her touch, becoming smoother, more uniform, more like porcelain. She dabbed and blended and dabbed some more, and every so often she'd tilt my chin up with her fingers to get a better angle, and I let her because I didn't know what else to do. After the foundation came concealer, which she used to hide the faint shadows under my eyes and the tiny red spot on my chin where I'd picked at a pimple 2 days ago. Then powder, brushed on with a big fluffy brush that tickled and made me want to sneeze. Then blush, a soft pink that she swept across the apples of my cheeks in a way that made me look like I'd just come in from the cold. Then bronzer, along my jawline and the sides of my nose, which she said was called contouring and was supposed to give my face more definition. I didn't understand any of it, but I could see the results in the mirror, and the results were undeniable. My face was becoming something new. The angles were softening. The proportions were shifting. Whoever was staring back at me in the mirror was starting to look less like me and more like someone I'd never met before, someone I might have passed on the street and thought was pretty and then forgotten about 10 seconds later. Then came the eyes. Cassidy leaned in close, so close I could smell her shampoo, something like coconut and vanilla, and she told me to close my eyes and hold very still. I did. I felt the soft drag of a brush across my eyelids, once, twice, 3 times, in different directions. Then the tickle of another, smaller brush along my lash line. Then something cold and wet, a liquid liner, she said, and she told me not to move a single muscle while she drew a careful line right at the base of my lashes. When she finished, she told me to open my eyes, and I did, and I gasped a little because the difference was immediate and huge. My eyes, which had always been sort of unremarkable brown circles, suddenly looked enormous. They had shape now, and depth, and they were framed by these dark, defined lashes, and there was a soft golden shimmer on the lids that caught the light every time I blinked. I looked at Cassidy in the mirror. She looked back at me. She was smiling, but there was something else in her expression too, something I couldn't quite read. The mascara came next. She warned me to hold still again, and she carefully coated my lashes, top and bottom, until they looked twice as long and twice as thick. Then she stepped back and studied her work for a moment, and then she reached for one more thing. A tube of lipstick. She uncapped it and twisted the bottom, and out came this creamy, dusky rose color that looked like it had been made specifically for my complexion. She told me to press my lips together and then part them slightly, and I did, and she carefully applied the color, tracing the shape of my mouth with the little tip of the tube. When she was done, she handed me a folded tissue and told me to blot. I did, without questioning her, because at that point I was completely in her hands, and she took the tissue back and studied my face one more time. Then she stepped back and said just one word.
Wow.
I turned my head slowly and looked at myself in the full-length mirror on the back of her bedroom door. And I stopped breathing. The person in the mirror was not me. I mean, of course it was me, technically, biologically, whatever, but it was not the me I knew. The me I knew was a scrawny boy with messy hair and a face that couldn't decide what it wanted to be. This person, this stranger in the mirror, had cheekbones. She had huge, soulful eyes. She had lips that curved like a doll's. She had waves of hair that fell around her face like she'd stepped out of a photograph. And she was looking back at me with an expression of pure, stunned disbelief, because she couldn't believe it either. I stood there for a long time, and I felt something moving inside of me. Something I couldn't name, something that felt like a door opening in a room I hadn't known existed. Cassidy came up behind me and put her chin on my shoulder, and she looked at our reflection together, and she said very quietly that she'd known it. She'd known I would be beautiful. She'd known all along. I didn't answer. I couldn't. My throat was too tight and my eyes were stinging, and I wasn't sure if I was about to laugh or cry or both. Cassidy seemed to understand. She squeezed my shoulders and told me we weren't done yet.
There were still clothes to try on.
She pulled me over to the bed and started sorting through the pile, holding up different pieces against my body, muttering to herself about colors and shapes and what would work with my skin tone. I stood there like a mannequin, my arms hanging limp at my sides, still trying to process what had just happened to my face. Cassidy finally settled on a dress. It was a deep burgundy color, soft and stretchy, with long sleeves and a hem that would fall to about my knees. She handed it to me and told me to go into the bathroom and change. I took it from her and walked down the hallway on legs that didn't feel like mine, and I locked the bathroom door behind me, and I stood there for a full minute just holding the dress against my chest, staring at nothing. Then I peeled off my clothes. All of them. Every last piece. And I pulled the dress over my head, and I felt the fabric slide down my body like water, and I zipped up the little zipper on the side, and I turned to face the bathroom mirror. And I saw her again. The girl. The stranger. But this time she wasn't just a face. She was a whole person. The dress hugged my shoulders and skimmed over the flat plane of my chest and cinched slightly at the waist and flared out just a little at the hips, and it was long enough to hide most of my legs but short enough to show my calves, and the color made my skin look creamy and my hair look darker and my eyes look brighter. I turned to the side and looked at my profile, and my breath caught because I looked good. I looked really, really good. And I didn't know what to do with that information. I walked back to Cassidy's bedroom in bare feet, holding my old clothes bunched up in my arms, and when I came through the doorway, she looked up from where she was sitting on the bed, and her mouth actually fell open. She stared at me for a long moment, and then she stood up slowly and walked around me in a full circle, taking me in from every angle. She kept saying, "Oh my God," over and over, in this low, odd voice. And then she made me put on tights, sheer black ones that felt weird against my skin at first, but somehow made the outfit even better, and she made me put on a pair of her flats, ballet flats in the same burgundy as the dress, and she made me put on a necklace, a delicate gold chain with a tiny star pendant, and she put small gold hoops in the little piercings I'd let her do in my ears 3 years ago on a dare that I'd almost forgotten about. And when she was done, she took my hand and walked me back to the full-length mirror, and she stood behind me, and we looked at what we had made. I don't know how to describe what I felt. It was like watching a movie of someone else's life. It was like waking up from a dream you didn't want to end. It was like discovering a secret room in your own house that you'd walked past 1,000 times without noticing. Every time I moved, the girl in the mirror moved too, and every time I turned my head her hair swished around her shoulders, and every time I blinked her lashes fluttered like butterfly wings, and it was me, but it wasn't me, but it was me, and my brain couldn't decide which was true. Cassidy told me I needed a name. She said the girl in the mirror couldn't share a name with the boy who'd walked in the door 2 hours ago, because they were different people, and she wanted to introduce this new person properly. I told her I didn't know what to call myself. She thought about it for a moment, tapping her chin, and then she smiled and said the name Rowan. I felt something click into place when she said it. Rowan. It sounded right. It sounded like a name that belonged to the girl in the mirror. I nodded, and Cassidy leaned in close and whispered, "Hello, Rowan," into my ear, and the sound of it made goosebumps rise on the back of my neck. We ordered pizza. That was what we'd planned for the sleepover, and Cassidy said we shouldn't let a little transformation get in the way of dinner. I wanted to change back into my regular clothes before the delivery guy came, but Cassidy laughed at me and told me not to be ridiculous. She said the delivery guy would take one look at me and think I was a girl, and that would be the end of it. He wouldn't ask questions. He wouldn't care. And she was right. When the doorbell rang 20 minutes later, I stood behind Cassidy in the entryway, my heart hammering in my chest, and she opened the door and handed the guy some cash and took the pizza, and he looked at both of us and just said thanks and turned around and walked back to his car. He didn't look at me twice. He didn't see anything unusual. He saw 2 teenage girls having a sleepover, and he moved on with his life. Cassidy shut the door and turned around and grinned at me, and she said, "See, told you." We ate pizza on her bedroom floor with our legs tucked under us and a movie playing on her laptop, and I kept catching my reflection in the darkened window across the room, and every time I did I got this little jolt of surprise all over again, like I couldn't quite believe that girl was me. Cassidy watched me watching myself, and she didn't say anything about it, but I could tell she was pleased. There was something in her expression that reminded me of a cat with a canary, a satisfaction that ran deeper than just having fun with her best friend. I didn't think about it too much. I was too busy trying to understand what was happening to me, because something was happening. I couldn't ignore it. Every time I moved in the dress, every time the tights brushed against my legs, every time I tucked a curl behind my ear and felt the little earring swing, I felt this ripple of something go through me. It wasn't just novelty. It wasn't just costume. It was something deeper, and it scared me because I didn't have a word for it, and I didn't want to have a word for it, and I didn't want to think about what it meant. We stayed up late that night, later than we should have, watching movies and doing our nails, mine in a pale pink, Cassidy's in that oxblood shade she'd started with. She braided my hair loosely down my back, and she showed me how to walk in the ballet flats without dragging my feet, and she made me practice sitting down with my knees together instead of sprawling out the way I usually did. She was teaching me, I realized. She was teaching me how to be Rowan. And I was letting her. I was drinking it in like water in a desert. Every little correction, every gentle nudge, every whispered instruction, it all sank into me like it belonged there, like there was a space in my chest that had been shaped for exactly this, and I hadn't known it was there until she started to fill it. Somewhere around 2 in the morning, we finally crawled into her bed. I was still wearing the dress, and Cassidy said I should sleep in it because it was too pretty to take off yet, and I agreed, because at that point I would have agreed to anything she said. She turned off the string lights and pulled the covers up over both of us, and we lay there in the dark side by side, and I could hear her breathing next to me, and I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears, and I couldn't sleep. I lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, trying to figure out what had happened to me, and what was going to happen next. And I couldn't come up with an answer for either question. The next morning, I woke up to sunlight streaming through the curtains and Cassidy already up, sitting at her vanity, brushing her hair. She turned around when she heard me stir, and she smiled at me, and she said, "Good morning, Rowan." And I froze, because I hadn't remembered right away. I hadn't remembered what had happened until she said that name, and then it all came flooding back, and I lifted my hand to my face and felt the traces of last night's makeup still smudged around my eyes and my mouth. Cassidy told me she'd let me sleep in. She told me to go clean up in the bathroom and come back, because she had breakfast waiting. I got out of bed slowly, my legs stiff, the dress wrinkled from sleeping in it, and I shuffled down the hallway to the bathroom. I looked at myself in the mirror, and the girl was still there, but she looked tired and rumpled, like she'd had a long night. I washed my face carefully, scrubbing away the smudged makeup, and when I was done, my regular face stared back at me, pale and boyish and familiar. I felt a strange pang of loss when I saw it, like I'd said goodbye to someone. I went back to Cassidy's bedroom, and she had bagels and orange juice waiting on a tray on her bed. I sat down across from her, still in the burgundy dress, and I picked at my food, and I tried to figure out how to tell her that I needed to go home now, that the sleepover was over, that we could put all of this behind us and pretend it had never happened. But every time I opened my mouth, the words wouldn't come, because I didn't want to say them. I didn't want to leave. I didn't want to take off the dress and put my old clothes back on and walk out that door and go back to being who I'd been before. Cassidy watched me struggle for a while, and then she leaned forward and put her hand on mine, and she said very softly, "You don't have to go yet." I looked up at her. She was looking at me with that same expression I'd been seeing all night, the tender one, the calm one, the one that felt like she was seeing right through my skin. And she said, "We have all weekend. My parents don't come back until Sunday night.
You can stay, if you want to."
I should have said no. I should have gathered up my clothes and gone home. I should have thanked her for a lovely evening and put this whole strange experience behind me. Instead, I nodded. I said okay. And Cassidy squeezed my hand and told me she was so glad, and she was going to redo my makeup after breakfast, and she had 100 more outfits she wanted me to try on, and we were going to have the best weekend of our lives. I ate my bagel in silence, and I watched her from across the tray, and I realized something that I probably should have realized the night before. Cassidy hadn't just done this on a whim. This wasn't a spontaneous makeover between friends. She had planned this. All of it. The clothes on the bed, the makeup kit, the specific dress in my size, the flats that fit me perfectly, the earrings for the piercings I'd almost forgotten about. She had been preparing for this for a long time. And now that I was in it, I wasn't sure she was going to let me out. That thought should have terrified me. It kind of did. But there was another feeling underneath the fear, something warmer and sweeter and much harder to name. Because if Cassidy had been planning this, that meant she had been thinking about me, about who I could be, about who she wanted me to become. And even though I didn't understand any of it, some small stubborn part of me was flattered, was moved. was hungry for it. Nobody had ever paid that much attention to me before. Nobody had ever looked at me and seen possibility. Nobody had ever cared enough about my face to plan out the exact right shade of lipstick for me. And now Cassidy was sitting across from me, and she was smiling at me over her orange juice, and she was calling me Rowan, and every time she said that name, I felt this warmth spread through my chest like sunlight. We spent Saturday like that. I don't know how else to describe it. It was the strangest, most surreal day of my life, and it passed in this dreamy haze where hours felt like minutes, and minutes felt like hours. After breakfast, she took me back to the vanity and did my makeup again, more carefully this time, teaching me the steps as she went. She showed me how to hold the mascara wand, how to blend the eyeshadow so there weren't any harsh lines, how to press the powder into my skin instead of dragging it. She had me practice in the mirror while she watched. My hands were clumsy at first, and I smudged everything twice, and I nearly poked myself in the eye with the eyeliner brush, but Cassidy was patient. She'd wipe away my mistakes with a cotton pad and make me try again. And by the third try, my hands were steadier. By the fifth, I was starting to understand what I was doing. By the 10th, I could put on a decent face all by myself. She watched me finish with a small smile, and when I was done and turned to face her, she nodded and said I was a natural. Then came the clothes. She hadn't been kidding about the 100 outfits. She pulled things out of her closet, out of drawers I'd never known she had, out of storage bins in the back of her walk-in that contained items with the tags still on them. Some of them fit me perfectly, which was suspicious and a little unnerving, because how had she known my measurements? Others were a little loose or a little tight, but Cassidy had ways of making them work. She pinned things at the waist. She rolled up sleeves. She belted things over other things until they came together. She tried me in every color of the rainbow. Soft blush pink, deep forest green, buttery yellow that made my hair look lighter, icy blue that made my eyes look darker, basic black, which she said everyone needed to have in their arsenal, white lace that made me feel like a princess, denim skirts with tucked-in blouses, sundresses with cardigans over them, wide-legged trousers that made me look tall, skinny jeans that made me look slim. She had me twirl. She had me pose. She had me walk across the room over and over, correcting my stride each time until I was moving in a way that was smooth and light, and just a little bit more careful than the way I'd walked yesterday. She took pictures of me on her phone, and every so often she'd show me one, and I'd look at the photo and I wouldn't recognize the girl in it, and I'd feel that weird ripple again, that door opening in a room I hadn't known existed. By the time evening came, I was exhausted in a way I hadn't expected. Not physically, exactly, but emotionally. I was worn out from feeling so many things at once, from being so many people in one day, from trying on Rowan again and again, trying to figure out if she fit me or if she was just a costume I was borrowing. Cassidy noticed. She always noticed things. She told me we were going to take a break. She sent me into her bathroom to take a bath, an actual bath, with bubbles and everything, and she left a soft robe hanging on the back of the door for me to put on afterward. I peeled off the outfit I was wearing at that moment, some kind of pleated skirt and cashmere sweater combination, and I stepped into the water, and I sank down until only my head was above the surface, and I closed my eyes. The bubbles smelled like lavender. The water was hot. I felt my muscles go loose one by one, and I felt my mind go loose too, and I lay there thinking about nothing for a long time. When I finally got out and dried off and wrapped myself in the robe, my body felt like a stranger's again, all soft and clean and warm. I walked back into Cassidy's bedroom, and she was sitting cross-legged on her bed with her laptop open, and she looked up at me and smiled and patted the space beside her. I climbed onto the bed and sat next to her, and she turned the laptop so I could see the screen. She had opened up some kind of shopping website, and there were rows and rows of clothes displayed on the page. She scrolled through them slowly, and every so often she'd point at something and ask me what I thought. A silky camisole, a pair of pajama shorts, a satin scrunchie. She was building a wardrobe for me. She was doing it right in front of my face. She was picking out clothes and adding them to a cart, and she was going to buy them, and they were going to be mine, and I understood then that this wasn't ending on Sunday. This wasn't a one-time thing. This was the beginning of something. Cassidy wasn't just my best friend anymore. She was becoming something else. Something bigger. Something with more claim on me than I'd ever given anyone before. I asked her, very quietly, why she was doing this. She stopped scrolling. She closed the laptop slowly and set it aside, and she turned to face me on the bed, and she took both of my hands in hers. Her hands were warm and small and steady. She looked at me for a long time before she answered. Then she told me she'd noticed me. Really noticed me. Years ago. When we were 14 and she'd stayed over at my house for a birthday party, and she'd woken up in the middle of the night and looked over at me sleeping on the couch, and she'd realized for the first time that I was pretty. She said she hadn't known what to do with that thought, at first. She'd tucked it away. She'd tried to forget about it. But over the years, she kept coming back to it, kept looking at me sideways, kept imagining what I'd look like if I let my hair grow out, if I let someone soften my edges. And when we got to be 17 and I still hadn't found my footing, still hadn't figured out how to be comfortable in my own skin, she'd made up her mind.
She was going to help me.
She was going to show me what I could be, because she thought I was wasted as I was. She thought I was hiding. I didn't know what to say to that. I sat there on her bed in the soft robe with my damp hair curling against my neck, and I stared at her, and I felt my eyes fill up with tears. She reached out and brushed one away with her thumb. She told me not to cry, that she wasn't trying to hurt me, that she was trying to give me something. And she asked me, very softly, if I wanted to keep going, if I wanted to keep being Rowan, if I wanted her to keep teaching me how to become the version of myself that she thought I was meant to be. She said it wouldn't be easy. She said we'd have to be careful about who saw what. She said we'd need to have rules. She said I would have to trust her completely, do whatever she told me to do, follow her guidance without question, because she knew better than I did what I needed, and if I fought her, I would ruin it. She said it would be like an apprenticeship, like I was her student, like she was my teacher, and in exchange, she would give me the thing I hadn't known I wanted until yesterday. She would give me Rowan. She would give me a way to be beautiful. She would give me a place where I belonged. I said yes. Of course I said yes. I don't think there was ever a moment when I could have said anything else, not after everything that had already happened, not after seeing Rowan in the mirror, not after feeling that door open inside me. I nodded, and I whispered okay, and Cassidy smiled at me, and she pulled me into a hug, and I could feel her heart beating against my chest, and it was beating fast, and I understood that this meant something to her too. That she wasn't just doing this for me. She was doing this for herself. She wanted this as much as I did, maybe more, maybe in a way I didn't fully understand yet. And I let her have it. I let her have me, because I didn't know how to belong to anyone else, and being hers felt like the first real thing that had ever happened to me. That was how it started. That's the answer to the question of what I mean when I say one sleepover turned me into her slave. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't scary. It didn't happen all at once. It happened in tiny increments, in one small yes after another, in the space between a Friday afternoon and a Sunday evening. By the time Cassidy's parents came home on Sunday night, and I finally, reluctantly, changed back into my regular clothes and walked out her front door with my duffel bag on my shoulder, I was already a different person. My face was scrubbed clean and my hair was pulled back, and I looked exactly like the boy I'd been on Friday, but underneath, something had shifted. There was a girl inside me now. Rowan. And she was awake. And she wasn't going to go back to sleep. The weeks that followed were the strangest, most disorienting, most alive weeks of my life. I went back to school on Monday morning like nothing had happened. I sat in the same desks. I saw the same faces. I ate lunch at the same table with the same handful of acquaintances who barely knew my name. But everything felt different because I was different and nobody could see it but me. I kept catching my reflection in windows and mirrors and thinking, that's not who I am. That's not the real me. The real me is at Cassidy's house, folded up in a drawer with the burgundy dress. The real me is being kept safe until I can go back and put her on again. I started counting the hours until I could see Cassidy after school. I started skipping activities I used to enjoy because they took time away from being with her. My grades didn't get worse, exactly, but they didn't get better, and my mom stopped yelling about them because she was distracted by other things, and I was grateful. Cassidy set the rules right at the beginning, and she was strict about them. Rule number 1, no one could know. Not our other friends, not our families, not anyone. Rowan lived only in her house, only in her bedroom, only when the door was locked and the curtains were drawn. Rule number 2, I had to come over whenever she called. If she texted me to say she wanted to see me, I had to be there within the hour. Rule number 3, I couldn't make any changes to my body or appearance outside of her house without her permission. That meant no growing my hair out beyond what was already there, no piercing anything, no shaving anything, no drawing attention to myself in any way that might raise questions. Rule number 4, I had to trust her. Absolutely, completely, no exceptions. If she said something was good for me, I had to believe her. If she said something wasn't ready yet, I had to accept it. If she told me to do something, I had to do it. She said this was the only way it would work. She said she wasn't being cruel, she was being careful. And I believed her. I wanted to believe her. Every Friday, I went to Cassidy's house after school with my backpack over my shoulder. I would walk in and she would smile at me and we would go up to her bedroom and I would close the door behind me and I would leave being a boy on the other side of that door. She had turned one of her dresser drawers into what she called Rowan's drawer. It held all the things she'd been buying online, the pretty little items she'd been collecting for me. Camisoles and skirts and dresses and tights and hair accessories. Nothing scandalous, nothing crazy, just soft, pretty things that a normal girl might wear on a normal day. Every Friday, she would open Rowan's drawer and she would lay out an outfit for me on the bed, and I would put it on, and she would do my hair and makeup, and we would spend the evening together. Sometimes we watched movies. Sometimes we did homework. Sometimes we cooked dinner in her kitchen when her parents were out. Sometimes we just sat on her bed and talked, and I felt more like myself than I ever did during the rest of the week. Because that was the thing I hadn't expected. Being Rowan didn't feel like pretending. It didn't feel like a costume. It felt like the opposite of a costume. It felt like when I was Rowan, I could finally take off the costume I'd been wearing my whole life. My real face didn't feel like my real face. The boy in the school hallways, hunched over and quiet and forgettable. That wasn't me. Rowan was me. The girl in the mirror with the wavy hair and the soft eyes and the pretty mouth. That was me. And every time I had to wash off the makeup and put my regular clothes back on and go home on Sunday night, it felt like putting the costume back on. It felt like disguising myself. It felt like disappearing. I don't know when exactly I started thinking of Cassidy as my keeper. It happened gradually, the same way everything else had happened. But at some point, I realized that I no longer made decisions about my own appearance, my own time, my own life.
She made them for me.
She told me what to wear when I was Rowan, and she told me how to behave when I was Rowan, and she told me when Rowan could come out and when she had to go back into the drawer. She told me what shade of blush I should try, what movies I should watch, what music I should listen to when I was at her house. She told me to sit up straight, to cross my legs at the ankle, to speak more softly when we were together, to laugh with my hand near my mouth instead of throwing my head back the way I used to. And I did all of it. Not because she forced me. Not because she threatened me, but because I wanted her approval more than I wanted anything else in the world. Because when I did things her way, she smiled at me. And when she smiled at me, I felt like I was made of light. I started to understand, slowly, that what Cassidy had done to me was something I could never take back. She had opened a door inside me, and now the door was permanently open, and I could see through it into a room I hadn't known I had, and the room was full of things I hadn't known I wanted. I wanted to be pretty. I wanted to be soft. I wanted to be looked at with tenderness instead of dismissal. I wanted to move through the world in a body that felt like mine. And every time I put on the dress and sat at the vanity and let Cassidy work her magic, I got closer to that. But every time I took it off and went home, I got further away. And the distance between the two was starting to hurt. The first time I cried about it was on a Sunday evening in November, about 6 weeks after the initial sleepover. I was standing in Cassidy's bathroom, scrubbing off the day's makeup, and I looked up at myself in the mirror, and I saw my regular face emerging from underneath, and it looked so sad and so wrong that I started sobbing. Just standing there at the sink, with my face wet and soap running down my cheeks, crying like a little kid. Cassidy came in when she heard me, and she wrapped her arms around me from behind, and she pressed her cheek against my shoulder, and she didn't say anything for a long time. She just held me. And when I could finally breathe again, she turned me around and dried my face and told me that she knew it was hard. She told me that she was proud of me for how well I was handling it. She told me that we would figure it out together. She told me that Rowan wasn't going anywhere, that Rowan would always be here waiting for me, that I could come see her any time I needed to. And I believed her because I needed to believe her, because if I didn't believe her, I don't know what I would have done. I don't want to make Cassidy sound like a villain, because she wasn't. She really wasn't. She was my best friend, and she loved me, and everything she did was because she thought it was best for me. But I also don't want to pretend that what she did was completely fair, because it wasn't. She held all the power. She had all the keys. She could open Rowan's drawer, and she could close it. She could give me the thing I needed, and she could take it away. And she knew it. She used it, in small ways, in ways that were hard to identify at the time, but became obvious later. If I did something she didn't like, she'd shorten my Rowan time. If I did something that pleased her, she'd let me stay Rowan a little longer. If I hesitated when she asked me to do something, she'd remind me of rule number 4, the one about trust, and I'd feel a little cold flutter in my chest, and I'd remember what I stood to lose, and I'd do whatever she wanted. Slave is a strong word. It's not a nice word. But there's a version of it that means someone who has given themselves so completely to another person that they can't tell where they end and the other person begins. And that was what I was becoming. I was slave to Cassidy in the sense that I had handed her the parts of me I couldn't handle by myself, and I trusted her to keep them safe, and I couldn't take them back without losing them entirely. Christmas break came, and Cassidy's family went to Colorado for 2 weeks. 2 weeks. 14 days without seeing her, without becoming Rowan, without touching any of the things that made me feel like a person. I thought I might die. I don't mean that dramatically. I mean it literally. I spent the first 3 days curled up in my bedroom under a blanket, and I couldn't get out of bed, and my mom thought I had the flu. By day 4, I was scrolling through the photos Cassidy had taken of me on my phone, hundreds of pictures of Rowan going back to that first weekend, and I was staring at them for hours, and I was aching for her the way you ache for a person who has died. It felt like grief. I didn't know how to feel that much longing and still keep breathing. On day 5, my mom knocked on my bedroom door and asked me what was wrong, and I told her nothing, and she looked at me for a long moment with an expression I couldn't read, and then she went away. I could tell she wasn't convinced. I could tell she was starting to wonder. I did something desperate on day 6. I locked my bedroom door, and I went to the drawer where I kept a single item I had smuggled out of Cassidy's house without her permission, one of the camisoles she'd bought me, a pale pink one with lace along the neckline. I hadn't been able to leave it behind that last Sunday. I'd tucked it into my backpack while she wasn't looking, and I'd hidden it under my mattress ever since. I took it out now and I held it against my face, and it still smelled like her house, like the lavender detergent and the coconut vanilla of her shampoo, and I put it on under my t-shirt. Just that. Just one thing. And I felt something loosen in my chest, and I could breathe again for the first time in days. I wore it every day for the rest of Christmas break. Under my regular clothes. No one could see. But I knew it was there, and it was enough to keep me alive until Cassidy came back. When she did finally come back, on the first Saturday of the new year, I ran to her house. I actually ran. 3 houses down. I didn't even bring my bag. I just showed up on her front porch out of breath with tears on my face, and when she opened the door and saw me, her whole face crumpled, and she pulled me inside and shut the door and held me for a long time in her entryway. She was crying too. She whispered against my hair that she'd missed me. She whispered that she'd missed Rowan. She whispered that she wasn't going to let us be apart like that again. And then she took me upstairs and she opened Rowan's drawer, and she got me dressed. And when I saw myself in the mirror again after 2 weeks of being nothing, I felt like a plant that had finally been watered. I felt like I was becoming real again. Something changed after Christmas break. I don't know exactly what to call it. Cassidy got more serious, more focused, more strategic. She started talking about the future. She started using the phrase, when you finally, and completing it with all kinds of things. When you finally get your ears re-pierced properly. When you finally let your hair grow. When you finally go on hormones. She had never used that last phrase before, and when she said it the first time, I froze. I didn't understand at first. I thought I'd misheard her. I asked her what she meant. She looked at me carefully. She was sitting at the vanity behind me, brushing my hair, and she paused with the brush in midair. And she said very gently that she'd been reading. She'd been researching. She'd been thinking about what I might want when I got older, when I had more freedom, when I could make my own choices about my own body. She said she wasn't pushing me. She wasn't going to force me. But she wanted me to know that there were options out there. That other people had walked this path before me. That I wasn't the only one. That there were ways to make Rowan permanent. Ways to make her not just a Friday evening thing, but a whole life. I didn't know how to respond. Part of me lit up like a Christmas tree at the idea. A whole life. Not stealing hours in Cassidy's bedroom. Not scrubbing my face raw every Sunday. Not hiding under my clothes like a fugitive. A whole life. Rowan every day, every hour, every minute. It was too big to hold in my head. It was too dazzling to look at directly. But another part of me curled up like a scared animal and wanted to hide. Because I knew what it would cost. I knew what my parents would say. I knew what the kids at school would do. I knew that if I stepped through that particular door, there would be no going back. And I wasn't sure I was ready to know for certain, no takebacks, no changing my mind, that Rowan was the real me and the boy I'd been pretending to be for 17 years was the ghost. It was one thing to feel that way in Cassidy's bedroom. It was another thing to make it official. I told Cassidy I needed to think about it. She said that was fine. She said we had time. She said no one was in a hurry. But then she said something that stayed with me for weeks afterward. She said, but you can't stop thinking about it either. You can't just tuck this thought away and pretend I never said it. You have to actually think about it. You owe yourself that much. And I nodded because she was right, and she went back to brushing my hair, and I sat there staring at Rowan in the mirror and trying to imagine her never having to disappear. I did think about it. I thought about it all the time. During math class, during dinner with my parents, during the long walk home from school through the cold January air. I thought about it while I brushed my teeth, and while I fell asleep, and while I dreamed. I thought about it so much that it started to feel less like a possibility and more like an inevitability. Every day, I got a little more certain. Every day, the world outside Cassidy's bedroom felt a little more unbearable. Every day, the boy I saw in the mirror felt a little more like a stranger, and the girl I saw on Fridays felt a little more like the truth. But there was a problem. There was always a problem. My mother had started asking questions. She had noticed how much time I was spending at Cassidy's. She had noticed the changes in my mood. She had noticed the way I flinched when she called me by my old name, though I was doing my best to hide it. She had noticed the pink camisole under my t-shirt one morning when I was rushing out the door, and my collar slipped, and she saw the strap of it against my collarbone. She hadn't said anything at the time, but her eyes had gone still and cold, and she'd watched me leave the house without a word, and I had spent the entire day at school feeling like I was walking on a wire above a pit of fire. When I came home that afternoon, she was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, waiting for me. She told me to sit down. She asked me what was going on. She asked me to please tell her what was happening to her son. And I looked at her, this woman who had raised me, this woman who had held me through fevers and heartbreaks and skinned knees, this woman who had made me lunches and packed my backpack and driven me to school for 17 years, and I felt my whole world tilt sideways. I couldn't tell her. I opened my mouth, and I closed it again. I looked at the table. I looked at my hands. I felt my heart pounding in my throat. She waited. She was patient. She didn't press me. She just sat there, holding her cup of tea, and she let the silence stretch on until I couldn't stand it anymore. And then I said the only thing I could think to say. I told her I didn't know what she meant. I told her nothing was going on. I told her I was fine, everything was fine. I was just tired. And she looked at me for a long, long time. Her eyes were red. She had been crying, I realized. Not right at that moment, but earlier, before I came home. She had been sitting at that table for a while, waiting for me, and she had been crying. And when I told her I was fine, she nodded slowly, and she said okay. Just that. Okay. And she picked up her cup and stood up and walked out of the kitchen without another word, and I sat there at the table alone, and I put my head down on my arms and I cried without making a sound. That was the moment I understood the true shape of what I was in. Because I loved my mother. I loved her more than almost anyone in the world. And I had just lied to her face. I had lied to her because Cassidy had told me I couldn't tell anyone, and Cassidy's rules were more important to me than my mother's tears. That should have stopped me. That should have been the wake-up call. That should have made me stand up and go to my mom and take her hands and tell her everything. But it didn't. Because the thought of losing Rowan was more terrifying than the thought of hurting my mother, and I had already given so much of myself over to Cassidy that I didn't know how to take it back. I was hers. That was the truth of it. I was hers, and my mother was going to have to find some way to accept that, because I couldn't be pried loose from Cassidy without breaking into pieces. I went to Cassidy the next day and told her what had happened. I thought she might be worried. I thought she might tell me to slow down, to be more careful, to give my mother some room. Instead, she got quiet. She sat on the edge of her bed and pulled her knees up to her chest, and she thought for a long time. And then she looked up at me, and she said something that surprised me. She said maybe it was time. Maybe it was time to stop hiding. Maybe it was time for my mother to know. She said I couldn't keep living this double life forever. She said the strain was going to kill me. She said she'd rather have my mother upset with us than watch me suffer any longer. And she asked me if I wanted her to be there when I told her. She asked me if I wanted her to hold my hand through it. She asked me if I wanted us to do it together. I said yes. Of course I said yes. That was always what I said. But this time, when I said it, I felt something that wasn't the usual warmth. I felt something colder, sharper, more clarifying. I felt scared. And underneath the fear, I felt something else. I felt relief. Because I was tired of hiding. I was tired of lying. I was tired of feeling like a fugitive in my own house. If Cassidy was going to help me tell my mother, then I was going to tell my mother, and whatever happened after that would happen. It was the first time I had made a decision that wasn't purely Cassidy's decision dressed up in my clothing. It was the first time I had wanted something for myself, separate from her. And I don't think she noticed, but I did. We told my mother the next Saturday. Cassidy came over, and we sat down at the kitchen table together, and my mother made us tea, and she sat across from us with her hands folded and her back very straight. And Cassidy did most of the talking because I couldn't get the words out. She explained what had been happening. She explained what she called the makeover. She explained that I had a different name that we used together, and that I had a wardrobe at her house, and that I had been struggling for a long time with feeling like a stranger in my own skin. She was careful. She was kind. She used the softest words she could find. And through all of it, my mother sat and listened, and her face didn't change. When Cassidy was done, my mother turned to me, and she asked me if it was true. And I nodded. And she asked me, in a voice so soft I could barely hear it, what my name was. And I said, Rowan. And her eyes filled up with tears, and she nodded. And she said, hello, Rowan. And then she got up and walked around the table and pulled me into her arms, and she held me while I cried, and Cassidy sat there watching us, and I could see her face in the reflection of the kitchen window, and her expression was strange. It wasn't triumphant. It wasn't happy. It was something more complicated. It looked, for just a second, like she was losing something. I didn't understand that expression until later. Not until much later, actually. Not until the whole shape of things had started to change. Because once my mother knew, Cassidy's power over me started to shift. Not disappear, but shift. My mother wanted to be part of it. She wanted to help. She wanted to buy me things, teach me things, take me places. She wanted to be a mother to Rowan the way she'd been a mother to the boy she'd raised. And Cassidy had to make room for that, whether she wanted to or not. Rowan was no longer a secret we shared. Rowan was a person with a family. And a person with a family belongs less completely to any one keeper. The months that followed were strange and hard and beautiful all at once. My mother took me to a therapist. She sat with me in the waiting room and held my hand. She took me shopping in real stores in daylight, and I picked out things for myself with her advice, and no one in the stores looked at us twice. She talked to my father, who I hadn't even mentioned in the story yet because he wasn't around much, and he took the news badly at first, but slowly, over many long conversations, started to come around. She helped me start figuring out what I actually wanted for my future, not what Cassidy wanted for me, not what I wanted in the moment, but what I wanted for the long haul. And that was when I started to see for the first time that Cassidy had been keeping me from making those decisions on my own. She hadn't been evil about it. She hadn't been cruel.
But she had been holding me.
And now that my mother had stepped into the space, I had room to move. I had room to breathe. I had room to look at myself in the mirror and ask myself the questions, not have them answered for me. Cassidy noticed. Of course she did. She was too smart not to notice. And she didn't like it. She didn't say she didn't like it, not in so many words, but she got quieter around me, and she got more possessive, and she started making little comments about how my mother didn't really understand me, not the way she did. She started rescheduling our Friday nights when I made plans with my family. She started sending me long text messages late at night about how nobody would ever know me the way she knew me. And I read those messages, and I felt torn in half because I loved her, and I would always love her, and she had given me the most important gift I'd ever received. But I was also starting to see that I couldn't build a whole life on the foundation of what happened in one bedroom over one weekend. I needed more. I needed my own room, my own choices, my own name that didn't come from her mouth. The confrontation came in April, on a Friday evening that should have been like any other. I went to Cassidy's house after school, and she opened Rowan's drawer and laid out an outfit for me. And I started to change, and then I stopped. I sat down on the edge of her bed, with the dress in my hands. And I told her I needed to talk to her. I told her I loved her. I told her that everything she had done for me had saved my life, and I would never, ever forget it. And then I told her that I needed to start doing things for myself. I told her I wanted to keep our Fridays. I told her I wanted us to always be best friends. But I told her I couldn't be her student anymore. I couldn't be her project. I couldn't be her secret. I had to be my own person, and I had to figure out what that meant on my own terms, and I couldn't do that if she was making all the decisions for me. I told her I was going to start therapy in earnest. I told her I was going to start talking to my parents about medical options when I was older on my own timeline. I told her I was going to start letting other people meet Rowan. Not everyone. Not all at once. But some people. Slowly. In my own way. Cassidy was very quiet for a long time. She was sitting at her vanity, and she didn't turn around to face me. She just looked at my reflection in the mirror, and I looked back at her, and the room felt full of things we weren't saying. Finally, she took a breath, and she said, "So this is it." And I said no, this wasn't it, this was just the next part, and I wanted her with me for it, but she had to let me lead. She had to trust me the way I had trusted her for the last 7 months. She had to hand me back the keys. She cried. I had never seen her cry before, in all the years I'd known her. She cried quietly, with her shoulders shaking and her hands over her face, and I got up from the bed, and I went to her, and I knelt down, and I put my arms around her, and she buried her face in my shoulder, and we stayed like that for a long time. Because I understood, finally, what she was losing. She wasn't losing me. I would always be her friend. But she was losing the version of us where she got to make me. She was losing the shape of a relationship where I was hers and she was mine, and no one else could ever come between us. And I knew, kneeling there on her bedroom floor, that this version of us had been the most precious thing in her life. Maybe more precious than it had been in mine, because I had been becoming someone through it. She had been becoming someone too, and she wasn't sure who she was without it. We didn't stop being friends. We didn't stop having sleepovers. Cassidy didn't get less important to me, and I didn't get less important to her. But things did change. I started spending more time with my mother. I started coming out slowly to a few carefully chosen people at school, people who took it better than I expected, and one who took it worse, but not as badly as I'd feared. I started letting my hair grow, with my parents' cautious permission. I started seeing a therapist who specialized in gender exploration, and I started very slowly, very carefully, sorting out which parts of Rowan were the real me and which parts had been Cassidy's projection. Most of Rowan turned out to be me, but some of her wasn't. Some of her had been what Cassidy wanted to see. And figuring out the difference took months of hard, painful work, and Cassidy wasn't always there for that work, because she couldn't be. It wasn't her fault. But this part one had to do alone. By the summer after my senior year, I had started introducing myself as Rowan in most parts of my life. I had cut my hair into a chin-length bob that I liked better than the long waves Cassidy had always encouraged. I had gotten my ears pierced properly, with my mother sitting next to me holding my hand. I was preparing to start college in the fall, at a school 3 hours away, where I was going to enroll under my new name and start over as myself from day one. It was the first time in my life I had felt truly excited about the future. And Cassidy was going to a different school, in a different state, and we both knew that the daily rhythm of our friendship was about to change forever. On my last night at home before I left for college, Cassidy came over. Not to my house, but to my bedroom, quietly through the back door, the way we used to sneak around when we were kids. She sat on the edge of my bed while I finished packing, and we didn't talk much, because we didn't need to. Everything important had already been said between us over the years. But when I was done, when the last box was taped shut and the last suitcase was zipped up, she reached into her bag and pulled out a small package, wrapped in tissue paper. She handed it to me. I opened it. It was the burgundy dress. The very first one. The one she'd put me in that first Friday night, 7.5 months earlier, that had changed my whole life. She had washed it and folded it carefully, and there was a note tucked inside it in her handwriting. She had written, "This is where it started. Take it with you. I love you, Cassidy." I hugged her for a long time. I couldn't speak. There was nothing to say. She had given me my life. She had also taken pieces of it. And in the end, we had figured out how to give back to each other what we could, and let go of what we had to. That is the real ending of this story. Not the ending where I became her slave. Not the ending where I stayed her slave. The ending where I understood what she had been to me and what she couldn't be forever, and I learned how to carry the gift she had given me on my own. I put the dress into my suitcase on top of everything else, and I closed the suitcase, and I walked her back to her car. She hugged me one more time. She whispered, "Goodbye, Rowan." She got in the car and she drove away, and I stood in my driveway for a long time watching the taillights disappear down the street. And then I went back into my house and I climbed the stairs, and I went to bed for the last time as a person who lived with her parents. And in the morning, I got up and I put on a simple pair of jeans and a soft green t-shirt, and I brushed my hair back with a headband, and I looked at myself in the bathroom mirror one more time before I left. And the person looking back at me was just me. Not Cassidy's creation. Not Rowan the secret. Not the boy I used to pretend to be. Just me. Rowan. Whole and imperfect and mine. I want to tell you what happened after that because there is more to say. College was hard at first. I had to figure out how to be a whole person in a place where nobody knew any version of me except the one I chose to present. I picked my new name legally that first semester, filled out the paperwork, went to court with my mother sitting beside me. I made friends who never knew me as anything but Rowan. I started dating, tentatively, cautiously, in a way I don't need to describe in detail here, but I will say that I found people who saw me and liked what they saw and didn't need me to be anyone else. I studied literature because I'd always loved stories, and now I had one of my own to understand. I called my mother every Sunday, and she asked me how I was doing, and I told her the truth. I called Cassidy less often than I called my mother, and that was okay, because friendship isn't a competition of frequency, it's a matter of what you carry with you. And I carried Cassidy with me wherever I went. She was in the way I put on my makeup still, even though my techniques had evolved. She was in the way I moved my hands when I talked. She was in my instinct to lean into softness, into detail, into the small choices that made a life feel considered. I saw her once during Christmas break freshman year, and once again the following summer. Each time, we sat in her old bedroom and drank tea and looked at each other and felt the way time had moved through us. She had changed too. She had grown out her pink streaks, and her dark hair fell down her back like a waterfall, and she had a quiet in her eyes that she hadn't had before. She had gone through her own things at her own school, in her own life, and we couldn't share all of them the way we had shared everything before, but we could sit together and know that we were both still moving forward, still becoming, still figuring things out. She told me, the second time I saw her, that she had been in therapy too. She had been working on the ways she had held me. She had been trying to understand why she had needed to. She had been figuring out what it meant to love someone without wanting to possess them. I listened to her, and I held her hand across the table, and I told her I was proud of her. And she cried a little and she smiled and she told me she was proud of me too. And I understood then that we had both come out of that first Friday night carrying wounds we didn't know we had, and we had both taken years to figure out how to heal them, and we had, in a strange and roundabout way, saved each other. She had saved me by giving me Rowan, and I had saved her by walking out that door. The last thing I want to say is this. When people hear the phrase, "one sleepover turned me into her slave," they think they know what kind of story they're about to hear. They think it's a story about power and cruelty. They think it's a story about someone being trapped, being manipulated, being broken. And in some ways, my story is those things. Cassidy did hold me. She did shape me. She did keep me on a leash, gently but firmly, for months of my life. But that's only half the story. The other half is that I let her. I gave her the leash because I didn't know what else to do with the girl inside me who was begging to come out. I made Cassidy my keeper because I couldn't imagine keeping myself. And when I finally did learn to keep myself, I could set the leash down, and Cassidy could too, and we could both stand up and walk away from that room in her house where Rowan had been born, and we could carry Rowan out into the world with us, changed but whole, on our own 2 feet. That's the truth about transformation. It's not something someone does to you. It's not a spell that gets cast on you against your will. Even when someone else is holding the wand, even when someone else is applying the makeup and picking out the dress, the person who gets transformed has to say yes, has to keep saying yes, has to want the transformation deep enough to trade in the old life for the new one. Cassidy showed me who I could be, but I chose to become her. I choose it every day, still. I choose it when I wake up in the morning and put on my clothes and step out into the world and let people see me the way I want to be seen. I choose it when I sign my name Rowan on documents and forms and letters. I choose it when I look in the mirror and I like what I see. And that's not slavery. That's the opposite of slavery. That's freedom. It just took me a while to figure out that the door Cassidy opened wasn't a door into her captivity. It was a door into my own liberation. And once I understood that, I could walk through it without anyone else holding my hand. I still have the burgundy dress. It hangs in my closet in a garment bag, tucked away in the back behind the everyday things. Sometimes, on quiet evenings when I have the apartment to myself, I take it out and I look at it. I don't put it on. It doesn't fit me anymore, not really, not the way it did back then when I was 17 and skinny and terrified and standing in Cassidy's bedroom for the first time as someone new. I've grown up. My body has changed. My taste has changed. My understanding of who I am has deepened in ways that 17-year-old me couldn't have imagined. But I keep the dress because it was the beginning of everything. It was the first piece of clothing I ever put on that felt like mine. And every time I look at it, I remember the girl I was becoming when I first zipped it up. And I say hello to her, quietly, in my head. And I thank her for being brave enough to say yes. That's the whole story. That's what happened when one sleepover turned me into her slave. It's not the story I would have told you the day after it happened, or the week after, or the month after, or even the year after. It's the story I can only tell now, 10 years later, from the distance of adulthood, with all the pieces finally settled into place. And I tell it because I know there are other people out there who have their own versions of it. People who are 17 and stuck. People who have a friend who sees them the way nobody else does. People who are standing in front of a mirror and don't recognize what they see, or maybe they do, and it terrifies them. If you're one of those people, I want you to know that the story doesn't have to end where it starts. The door that gets open for you can become the door you learn to open for yourself. The keeper who holds you can become the friend who lets you go. And the girl in the mirror who feels like a stranger can become the person you spend the rest of your life becoming. There's no shortcut. There's no clean ending. There's just one small yes after another, until one day you look up and realize you've built yourself a life. My name is Rowan, and this is how I got here. And I wouldn't trade a single moment of it, not even the hard parts, not even the parts where I lost pieces of myself trying to find the rest of me. Because in the end, all of it was mine. All of it made me. And I love who I am now, wrinkled dress and all.